Welcome to the Toronto International Film Festival. I'm Tom Powers, the documentary programmer. I'm super pleased to be here with Stefan Forbes, who is the director of Hold Your Fire, making its world premiere at Tiff. Stefan, welcome.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure.
So we can see in this film that the story was very prominent in New York City's news in 1973, but most of us have never heard this story since then. What drew you to that story?
You know, it's funny. I've been looking for something to do about conflict resolution for a really long time. I've kind of been fascinated by what makes people get into conflict, what are the causes of it in society, and who are the people that understand it and that know how to make peace and head it off and solve these situations. Being American, you know, violence, as they say, is as American as apple pie. It's in our DNA. And I've always thought it's something that we need to grapple with uniquely as a nation. I mean, there's some other people like Scotland, maybe, that we actually descend from who have historically had super violence problems. But I've been looking for a story to tell about violence. And a friend of mine mentioned this guy, Harvey. And they said, you know, you should look into this guy. He helped actually catch the son of Sam, and he did a bunch of stuff. And I started looking into him, and I was blown away by this crazy underdog figure in a militarized, paramilitary, top-down command and control organization like the NYPD, which is bigger than some nations' militaries. Here's this 99-pound intellectual, you know, Jewish radical empathy beat cop who happens to have a PhD in psychology. I mean, it's like, I'm in. Who is this guy? What did he do? And how do I start finding out about his life? And as I researched him, I started learning about this siege, which many people call the birth of modern hostage negotiation. And I really got in through Harvey. And as I started researching the story, I kind of started to say there's a little more here that meets the eye.
So Harvey is Harvey Schlossberg, who we see interviewed in the film, that, like you say, the kind of behind the scenes figure in the NYPD, who really pushed forward these ideas of conflict resolution. So you began with Harvey, and you identified this case as one to really bring out all of his story and his philosophies. How did you then start winning over the participation of all the other people in this story?
You know, I was so enamored with this crazy figure. You know, one of the things I loved about the story going in was, you know, it's Brooklyn in the 70s. It's one of these great, you know, Dog Day Afternoon, Serpico, one of these culture clash kind of stories, which, you know, this supposed melting pot where you've got these different ethnicities cheek by jowl. I wanted to get into that and find out how that played out in the story. And I had a really hard time tracking down the gunman. And I ended up writing letters and finally getting permission to go to Elmira Penitentiary and meeting Dawood in person and hearing about the story from him. And through him, he said, you know, we should probably talk to, you know, my co-defendant Shu'aib. And, you know, I'm sure you're aware that in these historical situations, there's a lot of people that are taciturn individuals. You always can find the talker, and that's the guy you want. And he said Shu'aib represented us in court. So I was like, okay, I need to talk to this guy. And I started researching him, and I found a Shu'aib Raheem, born the year he was born, sent to jail his year for manslaughter, who had died. And this was just a horrible realization. And I remember agonizing about writing Dawood a letter in prison saying, you know, this close friend of yours has actually died. You know, I'm sorry to be the one who tells you. And he wrote me back a letter going, I think he's still alive. You know, call this number. It was a nonprofit in Brooklyn. I called the number and I said, you know, I'm looking for this dead guy. I know he's dead. I saw his obituary, but, you know, if anyone has any information about him, call me back. And half an hour later, the phone rings and this guy says, this is Shu'aib. And I said, well, I'm looking for the dead Shu'aib who was involved in this thing, and I've seen his obituary and blah, blah, blah. He says, this is Shu'aib. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's still alive. And I knew he had a story to tell, but I had no idea that it would be so powerful and that it would question so many of the assumptions that people have about a case that really once was famous in New York, but is really only known as these horrible, violent cop killers who did this terrible thing and were let out as a miscarriage of justice. And they've been called cop killers in the newspaper and just smeared, and they never had a chance to tell their story. And I started going out to dinner with Shu'aib in these Indian food restaurants, like near where he was working. He was on parole, had to be home at a certain time. And we would just talk and talk and talk. And, I never was really sure that he wanted me to be the one to tell his story, but no one else was really banging the door down. And finally, one day he just turns to me and goes, when are you going to make this movie? And I was like, well, do you want me to? He's like, yeah, like, get going. And he's been a driving force throughout this in, encouraging me to talk to anyone, and even people that he didn't know what story they were going to tell and whether they were for him or against him. He really just wanted the truth to come out and a chance to re-examine the facts of this case. So it's been a fascinating ride.
Well, we see in the film that these days he's really dedicated his life to aspects of restorative justice. Can you talk more about that work that he does and how that work applies to the story in this film?
Yeah, it's really ironic and beautiful in a way that you have this figure, Harvey, that was this transformative figure in the NYPD who believed in radical empathy, that you could actually talk to your enemies. People were firing guns at you. You could use words and not bullets to find out who they are and to really, above all else, listen. And in listening, this radical act of really taking the time, solutions come out. And the second person in the story who really does that is the shopkeeper, Jerry Riccio, who is full of this macho bluster. I'm going to shoot this guy. I'm going to shoot that guy. I got my 9. And crazily enough, he doesn't. He doesn't shoot anyone. Jerry chooses the path of speaking and words and negotiation and intelligence. And the third character in this triptych is really Shu'aib. And through this long journey in prison, through being the imam in a lot of these prisons with his former enemies, the Nation of Islam, he was tasked with teaching these guys about true Islam in prison and mending these fences and being a shoulder for people to lean on and doing conflict resolution between Crips and Bloods and really dangerous situations. It's crazy, but he becomes a Harvey figure in the end. So it isn't just Harvey. This film is about different people doing a similar thing. And, I think it's really inspiring to listen to Shu'aib and to see the boots on the ground and the practical knowledge of this field that he's gained over all the years in his entire life history. And so many times, nonprofits and big institutions want to come in and solve problems, but they don't talk to the people who are on the ground, who have the institutional and the cultural knowledge in the community to really make this change. And we see it in Afghanistan right now. Biden, the administration could have asked any of these nonprofit people who were frantically trying to tell them they had problems ahead in this pullout, but they weren't listening to the people with the real wisdom, the stakeholders. And Shu'aib is an incredible resource for people who want to start solving some of these problems with the prison industrial complex in our country. So that's exciting to see him emerge as a voice for that.
Mm-hmm. As you get into this, and start talking to all these people who have never talked to each other on very, different adversarial sides of this story, it seems like you start to see different perspectives and see misunderstandings between them. And I wonder what that was like, being in the one person who was talking to all these people.
Very stressful. Very just, it's tense. When I started interviewing Shu'aib, to the police, I mean, this death of Officer Gilroy is almost this sacred event that you're never allowed to forget. I mean, it's like being Jewish. Like you never, ever, ever forget. And you end up carrying trauma with you as a culture in the same way that, you know, people do in the Jewish faith. And in a lot of situations, if you have that in your background, which I do, you know, my mom spent her formative years in a work camp close to Siberia. You know, it was this experience of being a refugee and having that trauma. And we carried that as a family. And I see that in the police too. And I see how that informs their anger when they feel disrespected and their rage. And to tell them, hey, I'm interviewing this guy Shu'aib, and you're not going to like what he says. In many ways, that was stressful. And I've been amazed at actually how many of them are really curious about him. Another really interesting thing has been their response to Gerald Lefcourt, a white guy who was the lawyer for the Black Panthers. And there's a special rage that they feel towards Jerry Lefcourt for a whole lot of reasons. You know, I wonder if in some ways it could be, you know, we get that Black people want to be for their cause, but the white guy that's going to go help them, it's a certain kind of betrayal, perhaps culturally. You know, that's been fascinating because they detest him. And it's been stressful showing this film to everyone who's in it. And I've told them, this film's going to be like a New York City conversation at a Rangers game or in a bar. You're going to be arguing with people you don't agree with. And that's what I believe in doing. I want to bring every perspective in. And so far, everyone has liked that. And I told them, you won't agree with people, and they don't. But I really value this idea of a film as a space where we can bring everyone in and we can have this conversation. And it's been incredibly hard. It's one of the reasons it's taken me so long to make this film. I've had to take some hiatuses and just try to figure out, as each new perspective came in, how am I going to tell Fonnie Buckner's story? How am I going to tell Jerry Riccio's story? How do I tell Rosemary's story? These stories are a burden. People confide in you as a filmmaker, and you have to do them justice. But you know, one of the toughest things is that I don't use a narrator. So I don't have this voice of God, and I don't want that. But trying to navigate and weave my way through, you know, the stories of different hostages, different negotiators, and different people severely traumatized by this event is a huge burden. And, you know, I'll tell you, Tom, it wasn't until really recently where I start to think, you know, all these problems that I'm having, bringing everyone into the story. Wow, that's kind of the problem America has. Bringing everyone into our official narrative of who we are as a country. It's really, really easy to say, oh yeah, we should do it. But to really make sense of it and to form a coherent, cohesive narrative as a country is not an easy thing. And maybe documentary filmmakers can kind of lead the way.
You described early on asking yourself, am I the right person to tell the story, being encouraged by Shu'aib. In the course of making this film, you've brought in a team of producers and others to bring in different perspectives. Can you talk about, you know, that team that you've assembled around you?
Yeah, I mean, before I even really started filming, even just with Harvey and only knowing about his side of the story, you know, I reached out to Fab Five Freddy just as a friend saying, hey man, this happened near where you grew up. You know, do you remember it? What are your perspectives on the event? And right away it started yielding dividends because he was like, yeah, Broadway and Myrtle, you know, that's where we used to go shopping. We'd get our sneakers and stuff. The narrative I was hearing about Broadway and Myrtle from the cops was, you know, it was dark, it was dangerous, you know, it was the Wild West. You couldn't go there. You know, you had your Broadway in Manhattan with the big lights and the famous people, and then you had Broadway in Brooklyn, which was dark and junkies and needles. And Fab was like, no, that was a great place. That was a strip of stores. So it's always super important to have different perspectives on a story and to have relationships and friends in the community. So, Fab took me over there to meet his uncle, who was a guy who was super involved in, the movement in the 60s and 70s. And, I knew that Fab came from that. His father was a Black intellectual. Max Roach is his uncle. So he knows about these cultural bloodlines throughout Brooklyn and New York. So I knew I needed that kind of expertise. My wife, Tia, is a really harsh, mean, terrible person who tears my rough cuts to shreds. And when you're trying to be the director and editor and cinematographer, because you really don't have the funds to hire these expensive editors, and I don't have producers on staff, I really rely on Tia and her eye and her ear to help steer me through that story. Again, it's similar with Amir Sultani. He has a knowledge of Islam just from growing up and spending his formative years in Iran that was really helpful on this project. Dealing with, the Nation of Islam versus Sunni Muslims and Muslim tradition in America itself. I needed all those people to just tear all my cuts to shreds, which they gladly did.
As we wrap this up, I want to ask you how you think the lessons of this case, should apply to our discussions of policing today.
As I pieced this together, it was an incredible shock to me. Ferguson happened, and George Floyd happened, and Breonna Taylor, and all this stuff's going on. And I'm going, they've had the solution to this stuff for 47 years, and nobody knows about it. And I realized every cop in America should be trained to diffuse conflict and de-escalate and to learn these skills that Harvey tried to teach them so long ago. It's tragic and somewhat criminal that this isn't more widely known. And we're really hoping that the film can change that.
And just last, I should note, Harvey Schlossberg passed away earlier this year. I wonder what your kind of last conversations with him were.
Harvey was an incredible figure. He had this love of life and this iconoclasm. And for him to exist in this really hidebound institution that's all about conservatism, conserving wealth, preserving the rule of law and protecting private property. And here's this enormously curious man who was, exploring till the day he died. It was enormously inspiring. And I know that he had a lot of critiques of the police that he didn't ever really feel comfortable sharing because he had to exist and try to make change inside this huge cultural institution from within. And he did that. But this film is now a chance for us to take his wisdom and really spread it through America where it's crucially needed. And I know Jack Cambria, the head of the hostage negotiating team that we interview in this film, has already said, Stefan, I want to use this film to train officers. And we need to get the word out there. You hear so many times, well, training doesn't work. Or you hear, it's got to come from the top down and we got to, lay down the law and we have to hold these bad actors accountable. Guess what? Both of those things are true. And you see in this film, as you study this siege, the commissioner said, this is how it's going to be. It's my way or the highway. And one thing about the police, they are a militaristic top-down organization. And if you tell them, if you fire your gun, you're going to be brought up on charges, guess what? They don't do it. So you need people who understand and believe from the top down, and you need education from the ground up. And it needs to be the right education. It needs to be taken seriously, not just something that's done in the academy and thrown away. So we have some really wise people in this film, and I'm hoping that we can put their wisdom out into the world and really help reform these horrible problems that are tearing our society apart.
Well, Stefan, we're really grateful to be able to present the world premiere of Hold Your Fire and really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for programming this film, Tom, and for seeing its importance. And we're really excited to be at Toronto.